There we go. All right, so now it's official, and it's 10:34, May 13th. So this is the Texas Early Learning Council's Early Childhood Data Roadmap Work Group meeting. I feel like I'm a flight attendant, so if you're on the wrong plane, now is a fine time to find your exit, but if you're in the right place, welcome. And this is the second time this group is meeting. So I'm Sarah Abrahams with Prevention and Early Intervention at the Department of Family and Protective Services. So today we're producing this meeting as a Zoom webinar, which means that the council members, presenters, and agency staff are participating as panelists, while members of the public are able to participate in listen-only mode, although there is an opportunity to receive public comment. Members, presenters, and staff, we're asking you guys to keep your electronic devices on mute when you are not speaking. And Megan also can mute meeting participants from her sort of facilitator place. Megan is our Interagency Deputy Director of Early Childhood Support, who's going to serve as our meeting facilitator. Please remember to state your name before you speak for those folks, both like for the record, but also for those folks who are joining us by phone and can't see our faces. The opportunity to submit public comment closed at 5 o'clock yesterday, but you can still request the opportunity to provide oral public comment today by emailing your request to Megan Schneider at this email that's on the screen and probably in the chat if I know Megan. And so just include your name as it appears on Zoom so we can manage the mute unmute situation, and your email address, the organization you're representing, and the agenda topic that you want to address. Do I review the agenda topics first, or do we jump into minutes?
You can go through the agenda.
Okay, why don't I do that?
Yeah.
Okay, so today in the next little bit, in our next hour and a half, we're going to talk about our April minutes and just give an official approval. We're going to talk a little bit about what is this data roadmap thing that we are wanting to put together, and talk a little bit about the proposed draft of that document, or how it will be organized. We'll talk a little bit about all the ways that we've solicited and gathered stakeholder feedback about what this kind of data roadmap would look like, and how we might want to integrate data, early childhood data among agencies. So we'll share a little bit about what we've learned so far. We're going to talk about how some of that initial feedback has lent itself to a handful of draft policy questions, or sort of the why are we doing this thing in the first place. And we'll talk together about that. We'll hear public comment if there is any, and then we'll just talk through and summarize what we've done so far, when our next meeting is, and what's going to happen next. So that's our plan for the next hour and a half. So I think we dive in by looking at the minutes from our April 2022 meeting, which is either in your email or, well, it is both in your email for our group members, or it's also attached to the calendar invitation. I came from Chelsea, so if you're searching in your email quickly, that's how I would search, right? I think it came from Chelsea directly, or in the calendar invitation. So if you haven't already had a chance to review, pull it up now and take a look, and then just ask if there are any changes or edits, and then we'll use our approval of the minutes also as a roll call for our team. So if there are no changes or concerns, then I need a motion to approve the draft meeting minutes.
April Crawford. Sorry. I'll go first. April Crawford, I make a motion to approve the minutes.
Seems like we might have a strong second.
We do. I second April's motion. This is Kirsten Schwab.
Thank you. All right, so Megan, can you conduct a roll call for approval
Yeah.
Hand over.
Yeah, this is Megan Schneider. I'm the meeting facilitator. So when I call your name, please reply for, against, or abstain. Sarah Abrahams,
Or
April Crawford,
4.
David Fagan,
4.
Kim Coffrin, Kirsten Schwab,
4.
Laura Varnell, and Allison Wilson.
4.
The motion to approve the April 2022 meeting minutes has carried, and we did meet a quorum during that roll call vote. And I'll pass it back to you, Sarah.
thank you. Feel very formal with our meeting requirements. So, okay, so let's dive into the overview of roadmap contents. So the strengthening data coordination is one of the 6 goals of the Texas Early Learning Strategic Plan. And this group serves as a subgroup or as a working group of the Texas Early Learning Council. Data integration has been a topic of discussion in the Early Learning Council for the past year as we've tried to sort out what we need and what is the next step. And essentially this roadmap is intended to be a publicly available document that outlines what early childhood integrated data could look like for Texas. The team at the PDG B5 TA, that's a big acronym. So PDG is pre-K development grant. B5 is before 5, right? I think like 0 to 5. And then the Technical Assistance Center. So this is a national organization that we've been working with, and they provided a draft outline of a roadmap in January that will present to the TELC in January. So can we look at the roadmap contents together? That is it, the next slide. There we go. So here's a bit of the draft of sort of the table of contents, essentially. And so the intent is that the roadmap will include background information. It will provide sort of an overview of our current early childhood landscape, because part of how we figure out what we want to do with data is based on the way that we're organized. And that's part of why our whole data thing is so complex in the first place. We'll, in this document, give an overview of our current early childhood data systems. So what data is available and how it's organized at a pretty high level among our agencies. We'll give some information about historical and current work related to early childhood data systems, both in Texas and potentially in other states. And one of the things that we did the last time we met was we looked through together some examples of how other states have done this kind of integrated data work, and what kind of data they focused on, and then how they've visually displayed that data for other stakeholders on their public facing websites. This work group, this team is really focused on these last 3 things. So we've already kind of reviewed together a little bit of the first part of what would go into a roadmap. And some of that is already sort of in drafty form. But our group is really focused on these last 3 things, and really primarily this middle one, which is how do we define the why? What are the use cases? So what would we do with the data that we're pulling together? What is it we're trying to learn, and why do we think that would have impact? And sort of giving some maybe even more concrete examples about how we think that data or that integrated data might be used. We have talked together about how to solicit additional feedback from folks that either would be impacted by or would use the kind of data that we would be integrating, and we want to include that feedback pretty actively in the roadmap itself. And then we'll also make recommendations for sort of the timeline, and then finally kind of approve like an executive summary or some tangible way of sharing what our recommendations are, both with the Early Learning Council, but also potentially with back to the stakeholders that gave feedback in the first place, and also potentially to decision makers, commissioners, and policymakers. So that's sort of what our charge is and how we're organizing so far. Anybody have any concerns, comments, additions to the way that we've outlined this roadmap and what we're working on? I'm going to take that as a resounding, everything looks great. It's exactly what I thought it was going to be. So then let's talk a little bit about what we know so far. Okay, so we spent some time when we were together last in April talking through the various ways that we've already been thinking about and talking about how we might integrate data, where data lies, why it's complicated in Texas. And one of the things that we've done in the interim is really taken a deep dive into the places where we've already received stakeholder feedback around data, around how folks use data, about what questions folks have. And these are two places where we dug in pretty deeply. And I think really Chelsea dove into the stakeholder feedback and helped us pull out trends and themes across that will be reflected, I think, in some of the policy questions that came up. But this Texas Ready Communities, Ready Schools, and Ready Students, so that's TXR3, which some of you are very familiar with. And this was the feedback. I see that Chelsea just dropped the link to the report in our chat. But this will really, what's important here is that we were able to pull from both surveys and interviews with stakeholders about issues related to data and integrated data. And then the second place was the Texas Early Learning Council Needs Assessment and Strategic Plan, which was conducted just a bit after the TXR3 work. And this both used sort of a meta-analysis of needs assessments that had already been conducted by various agencies and programs across the Early Childhood and Early Learning Council representative agencies, but also did focus groups and local surveys with providers and stakeholders across the state. So we already had a pretty rich starting place of stakeholder feedback to learn from and pull from. And then we have sort of a series of other places where we can identify some of these policy questions and use cases. And those include the Center for IDEA Early Childhood Data Systems, the information that we looked at with some of these other states that already have public facing sort of integrated data systems and data profiles. And then some of the work that we had been doing as an interagency group focused on early childhood data, and both at the state level, but specifically at the local level, PEI through some of our federal funding had supported a series of local data integration projects that resulted in these results-based accountability dashboards. And so in some of these communities, they actually, at the local level, were able to bring together stakeholders and identify specific shared data goals and outcomes that they wanted to track collectively. And in some cases, actually produced a visual dashboard that they are using at the community level. So we were able to take all the stakeholder feedback plus examples of policy use questions and other kinds of examples of how the data was being used so that we could start to pull together, like, what is it that we really want to ask? What is the problem we're trying to solve? And what do we think we could accomplish if we really started to find places to integrate the data? Okay, I'm just going through my notes to make sure that I hit all the things that we Anything else, Chelsea or Megan, that you guys want to add before we take questions or see if anybody has anything we missed?
No, I think you explained it very well. Thank you.
Okay. So are there any other areas of this work that you guys think we've missed in terms of identifying resources to draw from? And more may come up as we take a look at what we've pulled together. You might have something might come to you then. So maybe the next step will be just to take a look at the policy questions in general, because that's really the primary focus of our time today, is providing feedback on these questions. Thank you. I should have been watching ahead of my, so before I get to the policy questions, let me just tell you how we narrowed down from all those resources and feedback. Essentially, we were able to then go through them and address what were the themes that came up from all that stakeholder feedback, and what were the themes that we were seeing in the already existing dashboards and sort of publicly available integrated data platforms. And these were really the themes that came up over and over again, both in the sort of intent summaries in the resources that we listed and on the websites of the other states that we have been looking at. An increase to publicly available data in general, so just transparency and better understanding about the way the systems work. An interest in increased access to more granular data. So this was true both in terms of tracking outcomes over time, but also in terms of really being able to break out demographics, break out information by race and ethnicity, better understand sort of regional differences. One of the things we've been talking quite a bit about is all the ways that Texas has organized itself and how complex that often makes trying to overlay data from TEA to school districts, to our public health regions, to the DFPS regions, to the TWC regions. And when everyone's collecting data from a slightly different perspective, it can make it very challenging to figure out how to match it in a way that allows us to really explore some of the integrated data work. There's also just a general interest in making sure that the reports are clean, easy to understand, reliable, and timely. If we're receiving data 3 years later, then that doesn't allow us to make real-time changes or decisions based on what that data says and means. I think there's often confusion about, if we collect all this data, is it meaningful and relevant? Does it answer the questions we have? How to really narrow so that we're collecting what we need and not just collecting data for data's sake. And then the interest in connecting agencies' data systems, increasing staff data skills, and that was true both at the state agency level and with local providers and local stakeholders. Increasing alignments to ensure that we're comparing apples to apples, and that the measures in any of these individual systems was easy to compare to a similar measure in another system, and that has definitely proved challenging. And then just an improvement to data systems overall. And in terms of how folks have identified like why they need the data and how we might use it, it's really these 4 buckets that keep coming up over and over again. I don't think this should be a surprise to anyone on this call, but essentially, how do we make our programs better? How are we identifying what's working and what's not? Where might we want to press for policy recommendations or statute change, or in other ways identify sort of, once we've identified what we need or what we lack, how are we then using that information to clearly make a case or a set of recommendations? Resource allocation. So how are we both tracking and changing investments based on what the data is telling us? And really at the core of all that is identification of needs and gaps. I mean, that's sort of the frontline work of the data itself. And then the result would be program improvement, policy recommendations, and resource allocation. So this is all, I think this is all kind of baseline information and is part of what we would include in our summary of the roadmap. But I hope that this is validation that what we've been thinking has also been captured in all these other places that we've asked about data. The themes are very consistent, both in the way that we've captured feedback from local stakeholders, state stakeholders. When we look at other states, this information is pretty consistent. Any concerns, feedback, surprises, things we're missing?
I think it's a really great list. Anytime I try to think of something that might be missing, I kind of feel like it's couched within one of these things listed. So really great work from those who put this together. I think one thing I'm thinking of, and I think it would fall under granular data, is, on the use themes, we point out resource allocation. And I think understanding where spending is happening and kind of being able to tie that to kind of quality and impact, I think is going to be something that we really should strive towards. And again, I think that falls under the bullet of increased access to more granular data, but being able to understand more clearly, like, where is spending taking place in different communities, I think is an area we should specifically call out if folks feel that we need it to be more so. But I think it's a really great list. I think understanding quality, understanding impact, understanding disaggregation better, which is often so hard trying to do demographic and local, because then you start to get into messy data or masking that can take place that can really make things challenging. But I think these are really the right targets, and it's fun to dream of us meeting each of these needs at some point.
I think, David, you bring up a really interesting point, and it just made me think that one thing that we probably want to distinguish as we talk about an integrated data system is the places where we're collecting data for to answer more general questions. What are the general needs of this community? What are we seeing the impact of these kinds of programs? It's more aggregated answers versus what does this kid and their family need? How is this kid and their family tracking through the system? What are the outcomes for this kid in real time? And I think there's a lot of interest in being able to also have some shared data or shared integration that is that kid specific. But I do think it might be important for us to distinguish between data integration at the individual level and data integration sort of that's meeting this sort of broader, more aggregate set of like serve and response here in terms of what questions are we trying to answer is really more a set of systems questions rather than a set of individual family questions. Is this family getting access? Is this family's outcomes X or Y? How much are we investing in this family? I just think for the purpose of this, I think we're really distinguishing between those things, and what our role is and the policy questions we're asking are really more about that systems level work rather than that individual level.
Absolutely. And that's how I think about it as well. So yeah, just understanding kind of community, like spending going different communities in different areas and sort of where that might be having impacts.
Anything else before we? All right, well then let's take a look at the next slide. Just wanted to root us back in the early learning strategic plan. And these are the goals that have been set out for the Early Learning Council. I think as we think about what are the questions that we're trying to answer, I think it's just helpful to keep these goals in mind, even though the actual work of creating a roadmap fits goal 6. Essentially, the questions that we're asking and the work we're trying to do, really, there is a space for that work in each of these goals. And so we just thought it would be helpful to take a look at them together as we think about how to prioritize what are we trying to do here? What's the why? Okay, so then let's talk about the actual questions, or the actual sort of, I guess, the use case or the policy questions. So one of the things that we found, or really that Chelsea found as she was going through and diving deeply into all this work, was that there's really this one common foundational question from all the feedback, and that is also present in every single state's integrated data system. And that's the question of, who are we serving? What kids have, what kids are getting which programs? Do we have an unduplicated number? How are kids flowing through the system? This sort of question of who are we serving is in many ways just foundational for us to be able to answer any of these other questions. And so we kind of pulled it out rather than listing it among the other, rather than including it among things that we would prioritize. We sort of pulled it out to say, we really can't do any of the other things unless we did this. And so it sort of felt that foundational in terms of what would an integrated data system do. So I want to acknowledge that we're making that recommendation right up front. But then we found that there were these other 6 areas of policy questions that seemed to be most common in both the stakeholder feedback about what we would do with it or why we needed it, and also in the work of other states that we started to examine. And so we wanted to just pull out what these draft questions were, or these draft use cases. So I'm just going to go through them. The first, program quality. So this is really about, how do we know that it's working? How are we measuring success? What are the characteristics of the various programs that are associated with positive outcomes? So can we begin to identify common elements and sort of track quality? How are we measuring the ratio of quality things that are happening to other kinds of programs? And I think this happens both in terms of quality standards like Texas Rising Star, but also in terms of like evidence-based programming or other kinds of ways that we're identifying a quality interaction or a quality service. The next is teacher qualifications. So both, how are we identifying the level of qualification of both teachers and early childhood professionals? What are the investments that are leading to a skilled and stable early care and education workforce? How are we tracking professional development? How are we tracking whether many of the questions that we had connected, connected this idea of teacher qualifications to program outcomes, or even teacher qualifications to some of the other demographic information that was being tracked. The next is return on investment. So really being able to understand both in terms of outcomes and also in terms of dollar, how are we tracking the return on investment, which to David's point means that we need to have a pretty good understanding about what was the investment up front in the first place. How are we improving over time? So this is more of a longitudinal ask, but also how are we sort of defining programs along a continuum and measuring how they are improving? School readiness, or that is both kinder readiness, but also other ways that we're measuring our kids on track to succeed. So school readiness or kinder readiness is often a proxy for that, but it's not the only way that folks are measuring sort of positive outcomes for kids. So sort of being able to track that as a state and look across several metrics for positive impact and sort of readiness for success, both for kiddos and for their families. And then the last one is really around health outcomes. So sort of separating out school readiness or other sort of positive family support outcomes from positive health outcomes in terms of connecting with health statistics. So those are sort of the general categories of questions that we found in both the stakeholder feedback and in the literature as we compared states and questions that states were asking. So I guess I'm going to pause and just get your initial response to these kinds of questions, what you think might not be clear or what we might be missing from a list like this in terms of how and why we might use this kind of integrated data.
Sarah, a clarifying question, or
Yeah.
as I'm looking at these, and good morning, everyone. Looks like number 3 and number 5.
So teacher qualifications and program
Well,
improvement.
It may be program improvement are more geared towards specifically the early childhood education piece of the data versus the rest of them are all more inclusive of the education, PEI, like all the other services. So I'm just wondering if there's some way to clarify like which ones are very specific to the child care, pre-K, Head Start, like that landscape versus the other pieces of the data that are more inclusive of all the things that, you know, ECI and all the other things that we have data on.
I think that's a good point. And it may be that just in terms of the way that we name what this set of policy questions are, is that we don't limit the way we've named it to teacher qualifications, but rather to workforce development or something like that. Because I think in the language itself, it says early care and education, which I think speaks a little bit to what you're talking about in terms of having a broader.
Yeah, I mean, it's tricky, right? Because the child care world will call it early care and education because, you know, for years we couldn't decide what we were. Which is a whole nother, you know, 2-hour discussion. So I think we just have to be careful, like, because I totally like, do we want to collect the data on our ECI, you know, workforce as well and their effectiveness and alongside the child care piece of things. So
I think we do. I mean, I think that would be the intent, is that we're really looking at sort of the professional support and training for all the folks in this space, including specifically early educators. And I think certainly the work of defining the professional development and workforce development of early educators may be a little farther along than potentially of, say, home visitors or other kinds of sort of professional supports or even peer supports for families in this early care space. But I think you raise a good point, and it may just be that we need to address the topic more broadly, and then within that topic create some specific questions or measures.
Yeah, I agree.
I agree with Kim. This is April. My general feeling about it is that a lot of the questions come from education heavy drafts and sources, and it does feel like it could be broadened to be more inclusive of the early childhood workforce. And there are a variety of specialists in that workforce, including teachers, coaches, home visitors. So I think that's like an important framing decision. And I think part of why it's important is even like when I look at your topic 1 question, there's like a lot of data that has to come first before you can get to that policy question. And like the most fundamental is, who are the kids and which kids are in need and not in need. And sometimes I think when we have this education system framing that's leading, we start to like align and look at all of the data elements and pieces of information that are already available. And it's all like with a little bit older kids. So I mean, I think broadening to the whole early childhood experience and system and workforce, you kind of have to back up. Because like, I think you all, I mean, I know you all know this, it's your daily experience, I'm sure, when you try to link things, like you can ask these big questions and you can start to identify what are the outcome variables, what are like and it's actually easier to think about like the outcome variables and which systems might collect a piece or a part. I think what's fundamentally like the most challenging thing is, how do we even link any of this together? And that has to start way, way, way back at the beginning. So I don't know, that's my kind of in line with what Kim's saying. Like, I think when there's like a heavier education system focus, we still have to back up way, way to the beginning if you want to start linking these kids together.
April, first of all, I think you've raised some really important points, but I specifically think that it may be that we need to alter this foundational policy question that we've set out and remove this idea of kids in need as being a critical, not that we don't want to identify who are the kids in need, however, we're going to define that. And then how do we ensure that the need has matched the service, or that whatever the thing is that we were trying to improve gets improved. But I think you're right, sort of even at the more basic level, taking out the in need part means which children and families are being served or not by which early childhood programs. I think that's really the foundational. Then the in need part is like the second phase of that, really. So I think you're right. We maybe hadn't quite hit the baseline in the way we had intended. So I think that's an important point.
Not to dwell too much on wordsmithing, so forgive me, but and I want to uplift to something Andrea pointed out in the chat, which is around teacher qualifications. I like the way we explain what we mean, but rather than qualifications, I wonder if it's really just about effectiveness, because I don't want to make it seem as if our focus is exclusively on credentials or things like that, because there are so many things that lead to an effective workforce. So even if we shift that to a more general workforce theme rather than teacher, I think making it more just about effectiveness is probably the right route, and that can tie in compensation data questions as well.
That's a good point.
Well, and David, in that, I like the effectiveness, collecting the qualifications, collecting what they do have, right? So it's not that we don't collect and track who has what credential or degree, depending on your role. But that's not, we're looking at effectiveness. Qualifications and competencies is one of the ways to look at that effectiveness.
Mm-hmm. What are the questions we're missing here? What are the other things do we want to know, basically?
This is like sort of in the weeds, so it may not fit. But, I think, and it's implied in number 1 to some extent, we often don't know why people do not participate in services that they're eligible for. Like there's some way that you might use the data to look at people who don't stay in long, even though they're eligible. Like there are ways to build into your data things where you would start to track things like duration of service, so you could start to get at these questions of, hey, at least at least let's try to get a better understanding what the distribution of like uptake is for
Yeah,
people who are clearly eligible because they entered. I don't know how a system, I truly don't know how a system like this ever answers this question of, why are eligible individuals not interested in the service or not taking part in the service? Sometimes, like I think about in the research world and studies, we actually do document sort of decline, reasons for decline, why people aren't taking advantage of something. But I don't know, I don't know how you could sort of get to a point where you understand a little bit more about sort of continuity and consistency of uptake.
it's interesting because even like it's interesting to think about what in our early childhood, like our general early childhood space, is really seen or felt as voluntary versus not voluntary. And I think childcare is a place where that's a complicated question, less so than, but still complicated in terms of services like ECI or home visiting or, and so I do think that you raise a really interesting point in terms of not just access, but uptake. Yeah, I like finding a way to include that here in some way. And
I'm going on thinking about the return on investment. I know we've kind of talked about this, the purpose of the cost, but with the, what are the educational and economic returns on early childhood investments? Does that lead us to needing to know what it costs per child to really serve, to give children the services they really need?
yeah,
Do we need to know what that? It's no secret that the state underfunds all of these programs. So as is the federal government, right? So we know we don't have enough money in the system. So do we need to collect some data about what that cost really should be? And if I'm off, correct me if I'm wrong.
It's kind of interesting, Kim, uptake is right in between cost and outcome.
Right.
So,
Right.
the extent of uptake both either decreased the cost of service for that particular,
Right.
particular case, and the extent of uptake probably influenced the outcome. So the whole cost effectiveness cycle really depends on cost, good information about cost, deliver services, uptake of those services, and outcomes.
Right.
Yeah. So it is kind of interesting to think about how a system like this could, and I've actually been trying to think of the same thing, Kim. It's like to have cost at that level. I'm still processing what you were saying, David, about not wanting this at like an individual level, that it's still more aggregate. But
Right.
in my brain, like in my data brain, you really do at some point need to know cost per child, and that's influenced by the extent to which they participated or had uptake in the system. And that's really the only way to get to like good, I think, to get to really good return on investment information.
I'm not sure if this is covered in number 1, but to the question, like I'm just thinking about like the program quality question because it's something we're very interested in. And I think it's important to know the characteristics that are associated with positive outcomes, but also where are those outcomes happening? And so, for example, if we were able to find that a certain curriculum was leading to really positive outcomes in early education, or a certain type of progress monitoring tool was incredibly useful, are we able to then see where it's available and where it isn't? Because that's one of the things we struggle with in the pub ed space, is understanding, okay, so we know there are different choices that are happening in districts across the state. And so once we identify what works, can we then identify where is it happening and where isn't it? And perhaps that's covered in number 1, but I just wanted to make sure.
I think it's kind of a combination of number 1 and like maybe number 5, like, in terms of really thinking about, it's not, you're both identifying where is it happening and overlaying it with where are we seeing the outcomes that we want, so that we can make, again, it's about making distinctions between what do we want, like, where do we want to spotlight, what do we want to keep doing. I think part of the challenge in a state like Texas, and I'm not sure how we address that in our sort of data integration project, is that there are so many regional and local differences that contribute to whatever it is that the data is showing us. I mean, yes, numbers, and to April's point, potentially that's connected to regional differences in culture or uptake, or even relationships and trust with any of these given systems. But there's also differences in the programming itself, or in the access to, specific kinds of workforce development, or whatever it is. And if we can't capture what those regional distinctions are, then the work that we talked about doing before, which is to have more granular information, feels less useful, because you won't have you won't be able to explain or track what those regional differences are that might have contributed to the distinctions that you're seeing in the data. And so I'm not sure how an integrated system like this could speak to that necessarily, but I think maybe it's just one of the reasons why state level data in a state like Texas doesn't really tell us much. And that if we can't break it down smaller, even our big regional data doesn't always tell us much, especially when you have like a region that houses several different kinds of communities. And so sorting out how to get smaller is going to be a requirement of the way that we think about asking these questions.
And if we have smaller level, local level data, and we're tracking the things that tell us about program quality, then we'll be able to get at what I guess I'm shooting for. So
yeah.
If we're able to get both disaggregation and local data plus actually tracking the things that have been shown to be effective, I think we'll be able to get at that.
Do you think there's something in these additional policy questions that we can insert that helps us articulate this necessity for a more local approach to data? I haven't told, I'm sort of thinking out loud, which I'm sure is probably not a great idea in a recorded public meeting, but I am just trying to wrestle with how can we be clear that has to be a part of the way that we think about the why behind this work. And I'm not totally sure, but if saying that out loud sparks something for you guys, then that would be awesome.
I don't know if it's within the actual 7 listed here, or if it's more in our methodology or mission or vision of where that data comes from, that we integrate it from the statewide data sources as well as local data sources that we can pull that data from. Does that help at all? Does that make any sense?
It does, but I also think so here's, I'm going to throw this out. So even like in number 6, where the question is, are the state's children starting at birth on track to succeed? I wonder if we might even, as a part of that policy question, add something like, where in the state are kids most on track to succeed, or sort of how do we even in the language we're using and the question we're asking, identify sort of the regionality of it. And also, I mean, there are things that different communities can learn from each other, even if they're really different. It doesn't mean that you can just take something that's working in Longview and drop it into El Paso and assume it's going to work exactly the same. But I do think that it helps us understand how things might be, like why things are successful, how to spotlight where things are working. And so I just wonder if we might, even into the big policy questions, build in like a regional component to it. And also a, yeah.
I think you're asking this in a better way than I was earlier, which is, yeah, I think like, I think I'm feeling that same way, which is like, do we have a question that's helping us get at where? Like, where are things happening? Like,
Right.
Where is their program quality? Where is their lack of access? Where is their significant return on investments happening? Because if we think of everything in terms of the state, it's very hard to draw out the lessons of that, because
Yeah.
where is that occurring? So
Is that a
policy question? Yeah, sorry, go ahead, Kim.
is that a question in itself, or is that a product of the tool that will display that information? I'm thinking of like the different dashboards that are out there, that when all this data is collected, then you can, zone in on that county or that local workforce board, and then you can from there and analyze where those differences are. Like, I don't know if it needs to be a question. Like, it may be a founding question, a founding principle, more than a policy question, but more of just a principle that we are going to collect at the local level. So that way we have statewide numbers, but we can also then look at El Paso and look at Longview and see those differences and whatever that dashboard ends up, that end product ends up being.
Well, so we're developing obviously one of these use cases, and with the school readiness dashboard. And
Right.
I think that, of course, what we're running into is so many data sources that do not have local data, or the local data they have is not particularly reliable.
Okay.
And so I wonder if having a policy question, and I don't know the correct way to phrase it, but around understanding, how to improve the local data we have and draw out those lessons that help us answer these other questions at a more granular, specific level, would be, I think, an incredible victory of this project if we're able to find a way to do that. And we have, it goes back to what we said earlier. It's like, the more granular you get, the more challenging it currently is with disaggregation or local understandings, but that's so essential in a state like Texas, like Sarah said. So I don't know if it's captured anywhere. So I feel like it could be an additional question, but I don't know how to phrase it exactly.
I think what I'm trying to figure out is, like, rather than make it seem like it's a local responsibility, in many ways, the state probably has a lot of motivation to better target resources regionally. And even if that targeting means, hey, we need to strengthen the qualifications of our workforce in this region because they need to deliver the programs at a higher level of quality. Or, we have a growing child population in this community that these kids are in high need, and we need to think about resource allocation there in a different way than we do in a community where population is declining and there aren't as many kids. So I think I'm wondering if there's a way to frame it so it doesn't seem like, oh, it's the community's responsibility to do it, but that it becomes a more integral part of how the state thinks about needing their data codified by region, so they are able to kind of make these more regional decisions about performance and targeting.
Well, and I agree completely with that. And I think that that's perhaps another motivation for having a question specifically geared towards that, because this is a state.
Yeah.
So by doing so, I think we would be asserting, like, there's a state responsibility to improve that local data. Because I agree with all that.
Any other comments or additions? I think, okay, so with your permission, I think we're gonna try something. And we're not gonna hold you to it. This is not a set in stone kind of situation, but I think we are going to just try to get an initial take on how to prioritize these. So I'm gonna do something that everyone hates, which is that I'm gonna force you to rank these in order of importance. So Chelsea and Megan, I think we actually have can you help me explain what we're gonna do next?
Yeah, so this is Megan. I'm gonna launch the poll and everyone will see it. So attendees and panelists, and you'll see, I'll launch it right now. You should see the opportunity to select number 1 through 6 for each of questions 2 through 7. And to remind yourself what those questions are, just pull the poll out of the way so you can see the whole slide. So obviously number 1 would be your top pick, like that's the most important, down to number 6. And then just press submit.
But we can't vote. Is that right?
No, anyone can vote. Any panelist should be able to vote. Did y'all not see it pop up?
On my thing, it says I have a little red note at the bottom that says hosts and panelists cannot vote.
Okay, then hold on. No one look at that one. I'm gonna relaunch it.
You don't get off that easy.
All right, Sarah, you have to vote.
Now, did you all see it pop up?
Yep,
Okay.
Yes.
Sarah, can I ask a clarifying question? Are we ranking these in order, like pretending that all of these things are equally feasible?
Yes.
Or are we supposed to consider what we think is already well on its way or not developed?
I think we are asking you to rank them in terms of what you think is most important for us to measure. Like if you could only pick one, which one would you pick? And then go that way. So yes, I agree. It's imperfect. And
Can I ask a question? This is Kirsten. Is program participation a given we've prioritized that already? So it's prioritizing 2 through 7. Am I understanding right?
yes, that's right. The only ones we've listed on this poll are the 6 additional policy questions.
Because the assumption is you sort of have to do that first one to do any of the others. So I'll give folks maybe another minute.
No. Hold on.
Oh, okay. I'll give folks another 2 minutes.
More than a minute, Megan.
2 whole minutes, 120 seconds. 120 seconds right now. 3 people have already filled it out. 3 of this.
Well, overachievers.
Not me, I'll tell you that much.
Overthinking it.
And we can, Sarah mentioned this is not binding, this isn't like a final. We also talked about a lot of wordsmithing to these questions. So we'll pick this up and continue it in future meetings as well.
But it does help us, I think, know where we might want to put more energy into better defining or articulating or even gathering some specific examples from other states for us to think about and consider. It's a lot of work in here. So doing this kind of prioritizing might help us just organize our thinking a little bit.
And did we decide to call number 3 early childhood workforce more broadly?
I think we did. Yeah. David's doing the decision-making dance.
I'm notorious, Sarah, for taking like icebreaker questions too seriously. So this is like
Noted.
What's your favorite music to work out to? Ah!
literally, Kim, literally. Yeah.
I just realized I put mine in the order that you'd put them into a model from like the most fundamental data all the way to the outcomes to the return on investment.
You researcher,
On our
you.
researchers for
Can't
that
help it, I
kind
guess
of
we just have
feedback.
Thanks, April. Someone had to do it.
All right. Last call. Is anyone still working on theirs?
All right, big reveal.
All right, I'm going to end the poll. And you should now see the results. So the colors are a little confusing.
Oh, okay.
Uh-huh.
If you scroll all the way down to the bottom, that's the legend of what is number 1 through number 6. Unfortunately, number 1 and number 2 are very close colors of blue. I don't get to pick what, which is which. But that lighter color blue that you see under program quality, that means that those are the people who ranked it number 1. That darker blue is people who ranked it number 2, etc. And if you mouse over, you should be able to see it kind of gives you that breakdown of the number of responses and percentage of responses
okay.
in each grade. So this, if I'm reading it right, Chelsea, check me. I see that people ranked program quality and school readiness. The most people ranked that number 1. And our sample size here is like 12 people, so.
Right.
We're going to decide for the state.
Yeah, this is really helpful. I think it's just helpful to see this visually as a quick, I mean, if we did this with the whole early learning council, which we may in July, or at least give a, sort of outline how we came to however we're prioritizing. We may not give them the opportunity to change our recommendations in July, but I do think this is a really quick visual on where to get started. Why is the E and F not 100%? Does that mean not everyone even included it on their feedback? Interesting.
It's hard. So I don't know what takeaways y'all are getting. One of mine is I feel like we very much did not agree, which is fine because I thought all of them were important. I'm sure everyone did too. But I mean, it's like I look through and there's like, even the ones that perform the best, it's like there's also several people that had them among the lowest, and it's really interesting. I don't know. It was hard choices.
To me, I think one of the things that made it difficult for me is that I don't know that we've articulated clearly the differences between each of these. And so like I got stuck on the difference between 2 and 5. I wasn't sure that I could really clearly articulate that. So it just makes me think as we go back to sort of bucketing out what it is that we're asking, that we may need to be more clear about removing the Venn diagram of things, or at least being clear where there's overlap. And I don't, and I can also imagine, I'm a very visual thinker. And so I sort of like to April's point about how all of these kind of, there is somewhat of a research order to these, or there is a little bit of, you kind of have to have one before the other. I think laying some of that out visually might be helpful just in terms of thinking about this as an actual roadmap. And so that was the other thing that I was thinking as I was kind of trying to figure out how to order these.
And
I was doing this.
Okay,
go ahead, David.
Okay, I just will quickly say that of course for me and Texans Care for Children's position is that 6 and 7 are completely linked. And so I struggled a bit with that, but sorry.
Yeah, I was just going to say I struggled with 2 and 3 because you have to, in order to have program quality, you have to have your staff have qualifications and competencies that they need. So it's like, which one's first?
Yeah.
So it was.
Yeah, I can see why that's a difficult thing to separate out.
Right. All roads to quality lead through your workforce, right? So wherever, if that's home visiting or a center or home-based.
I mean, because the truth is a huge percentage of what we're investing in any of these early childhood programs is staff, right? I mean, that's what it is. It's not pencils, it's people. And so I totally agree. It's impossible to untangle that exactly, but trying to figure out like which component of that are we measuring, I think, or how we're getting to it. But I think that's a really important point.
Do you think in the roadmap will actually, there will be a framework that helps organize these questions so people can see which ones are inputs? Within the inputs, some of these input questions are just about utilization, not the quality of the service that was provided or the system's commitment to strengthening that quality. So like there's a set of inputs. Some are just access. Are the things available in the system and do people use it? And then there's a set of questions under inputs that's really more about what's the quality of the service that's there. And then there's another kind of related question in here that's about, do we have evidence that helps us know our systems are trying to improve the quality of those systems or services? And then there's a whole nother strand of these questions that are really about the outcomes.
Yeah.
Sometimes
April, I really love the way that you've bucketed that out, because I think those 4 categories of data it's just so helpful to think about it in that way. So yes, I think we should create some kind of visual representation of what you've just outlined. I think that was so helpful to think about it in that way.
And I just wanted to say, we ran into something very similar when developing kind of the skeleton. Obviously we don't have a dashboard yet, but the skeleton for the school readiness dashboard was, we started to realize that we had different measures that were sort of child outcomes of like a child who's experiencing food insecurity, and a kind of access measure of like a child has access to SNAP. And we started to realize we needed to kind of try to have both in each of our main buckets of what is the sort of programs and services that children have access to that are relevant in these buckets, and what are the kind of proof points of consequences in many cases of not having access to those things. You can't always draw a straight line, obviously, but that was sort of a task we had, was to sort of identify on good health and development, like an outcome is a rate of the children having low birth weights, and an access measure could be the rate of children accessing Medicaid and CHIP. And so, or women having, postpartum supports. And so, anyway, I just wanted to flag that we had a sort of similar thing where we had to think through, like, we can't rely simply on access measures or sort of child level outcomes.
Yeah. All right, any other comments on these? Okay, so I think we're gonna pause and see if we have any any folks that have asked to make public comment, and then we're gonna talk a little bit about what do we do next and how to get organized from here.
This is Megan. We did not have anyone register for public comment, but for those of you tuning in, please know that you're always welcome to provide public comment. So earlylearningtexas.org has a section called meetings. That's where you found the link for this website. It also has instructions about how to submit public comment. Basically just email me and I'll help you do it. And then even if you missed the deadline of 5 p.m. the day before, we always put the information in the chat, and you're welcome to just send an email to me at any point during the meeting prior to this moment of public comment, because we'd love to hear y'all's thoughts as we go forward. I'll pass it back to you, Sarah.
Okay. So then let's talk about what our plan is next. So the next meeting for this group is Friday, June 17th from 1 to 2:30. And then the next Early Learning Council meeting is July 15th. And this work group is planning on providing an update and presenting some initial recommendations for the path forward to the Early Learning Council in July. So I think that by the July meeting, we should be prepared to have outlined sort of the roadmap contents, sort of the framework that we're working with, and the ways that we are beginning to prioritize the use cases and policy questions. And I think part of what we'll spend our time next Friday talking through is a set of recommendations about additional stakeholder feedback or other ways that we want to finalize what the roadmap is and what the use cases are. Part of what I think is sort of missing here is some confirmation from stakeholders, including folks at the local level who would actually be using this data or who have some of these same questions, so that we can incorporate that clear feedback into sort of a final use case document. Because the purpose of creating this roadmap is essentially to say, we have the outlines of a plan. We may not yet have all the details or the cost or sort of the technical components of how we're going to marry this all together, but we're clear about what we want to do and why. And so what we're asking for is a shared commitment by, agency leadership or legislators or whoever, sort of the folks who can grant the green light for a formal investment in this kind of collaborative state work. And this is the making the case and the plan for that to happen. So I think what we'll do then in July is take all of these conversations, present it back to the Early Learning Council, along with a set of recommendations about stakeholder engagement and finalizing that roadmap. We'll get the Early Learning Council sort of thumbs up that we're headed in the right direction and that we haven't gone rogue and that this is what they expected from us. And then we'll spend really the late summer and early fall doing that work with the idea that we would have a final thing to turn into them by the January TELC meeting. Megan and Chelsea, did I get that timeline correct? Yes, fantastic. So I think that's sort of our plan. I think Chelsea and Megan are going to help me organize all the thinking that we did and bring it back to have you guys take another look when we come back together in June. Then we'll talk a little bit about finalizing these prioritized questions and then talking about what the recommendations are that we're going to make back to the TELC, both in terms of the roadmap, the visual representations, and then the stakeholder engagement work in the late summer and early fall. Anything else? Any final comments or questions or?
Sarah, can I ask a clarifying question?
Yes.
With the timeline, and then when it gets to the point of raising this up to commissioners or governor or ledge and funding it, is that something that we're thinking will just happen within everybody says yes, that will just happen within state agencies' normal budgets, or will that be something specific we'll need to ask the ledge for, or we don't know? Okay.
I don't think we know yet. I mean, at this point, we don't really even have a price tag on
right
what we're talking about. So I do think that would be sort of a natural next step, is to say, okay, here, now that we're clear about exactly what it is that we want, what the questions are that we want to answer and what data we think we'd need to answer those questions. The next set of questions is really, okay, so what is that going to take? Technically, how do we make that happen? What are the agreements that need to be in place? How much, what needs to change in our current setup? And even that's going to have a cost to just figure that part out, and figuring out who's going to do that and sort of tackle.
Where does that live? Right. Yep.
Yeah. So I think that will be a part of what the Learning Council will likely discuss in July, but then certainly once we've pulled together the formal recommended framework.
Right. Thank you.
David, can I ask, is part of what Texans Care working on, in addition to the dashboard of sort of existing information, is highlighting what's missing, and is cost a part of the information you're gathering in terms of what it, like, next steps, or is that not yet on the horizon?
I would say that identifying gaps and identifying what is missing is definitely a part of what we'd like to highlight. In terms of identifying costs of what it would require to fill those gaps. I imagine, I don't know exactly how we would do that, although I think that would be a logical next step in
Yeah.
sort of thinking through our advocacy around getting those gaps filled, if that makes sense. But certainly we want to be able to say, this data does not exist. We think it would be incredibly useful if it did.
Great. All right. I love it when a meeting ends early. So if there's no final flags, then we'll send out the minutes from this meeting after the fact, and and an agenda ahead of our time together on June 17th.
Thank you, Sarah.
All right. Well, then I'm
you all.
supposed to officially close. Do I officially end the meeting right now at 11:50? And see you guys in June.
That's good. Bye, y'all. Have a good weekend.
Bye.